Dear viewer, welcome to an age of elegance and romance. Step into the Regency era, a world of glittering ballrooms, whispered secrets and hearts entwined. Here, dukes, ladies, and daring heroines find love where least expected. Join us as we bring you timeless tales of passion, intrigue, and happily ever afters. Do subscribe and become part of our society of readers, where love and story reign supreme. 1. Portland Place. The first snow of January softened the edges of Portland Place, laying a hush over the bright brass knockers and the parade of carriages. Inside number 12, where the walls were hung with new landscapes and the mirrors had been wheeled in from the upholsterer only last week, Mr. Josiah Hartwell stood before his daughter and made a speech he had rehearsed 3 times that morning. "You will be a marchioness, Margaret," he said, his hands spread as if he were unveiling one of his warehouses. "It is a good step for you, good for our name, good for England, by which I mean our part in it." Margaret Hartwell, Meg, to no one but her mother, who had been gone 2 years, sat with her gloves in her lap and her heart attempting a panicked escape. She was an heiress, yes, a Sitz girl, daughter to a man whose ships brought sugar and coffee and calicos, whose banks lent money at rates the ton preferred not to discuss while happily enjoying their dividends. She had grown up amid ledgers and ledgers' consequences, new schools endowed, almshouses painted fresh, warehouses opened at the river. She knew something of sums and something of sorrow, and something too about how the world looked down its nose while still extending its hand. "Lord Ashborne is a nobleman," Mr. Hartwell continued as if reading from a bill of lading. A Marquis, child, and his estate is ancient. It wants funds, that is no secret, but you want consequence, and he wants capital, and the two together make a house." Meg looked at the firelight quivering on the new ormolu clock. "And what do we make, Papa?" "He and I? A family," said Mr. Hartwell, with a gentleness that startled her. If fortune is kind, and if he is not a fool, Meg thought of the portrait she had seen in the Morning Post. Daniel, Marquis of Ashborne, at 32. Dark hair, paler eyes, shoulders that looked as if he had been born to wear a regimental coat and had only reluctantly exchanged it for superfine. He was handsome, which was both reassuring and not. He was also of that set who had danced at Carlton House and hunted at Melton, and would prefer not to know where money came from, only that it arrived. She rose and took her father's hand. "I shall do my duty," she said, which was the only answer she could make in a room full of new mirrors. 2. An arrangement. The thing was arranged by men with quill pens and by women with smiles that could calcify. The dowry was enormous. A settlement that might restore a roof, drain a fen, redeem a mortgage, plant 100 acres of hedging for beauty alone. The marriage took place at St. George's, Hanover Square, where Meg's bouquet of winter heliotrope shook in her hands like a compass pointing toward an unknown north. He stood at her side, a man carved from pride and polish. His voice was pleasant when he made his vows, capable even of warmth, though not for her. She was clear-sighted enough to know it. He had expected to marry elsewhere, Lady Arabella Beaufort, daughter to a duke, a woman whose laugh was said to be as light as silk, and whose blood was so blue one could see through it to the ice beneath. Meg had heard the whispers. Poor creature, bought in silk, poor man, sold to tallow, and lifted her chin as the ring slid onto her finger. At the breakfast, Lady Arabella did not appear, which was either a kindness or a cruelty, depending on how one calculated. The Duke sent his congratulations on heavy paper. The city sent bouquets. Mr. Hartwell dabbed his eye with a spotless handkerchief, which he told everyone was due to the cold. Daniel, she was not yet used to the name, nor to the rank, offered her his arm when the time came to depart. "Lady Ashborne," he said, testing the taste of it. "Meg," she returned, because his mouth had tightened at the title as if it bored him. He looked as if she had taken something from him. Margaret, he corrected, and handed her into the carriage bound for Ashborne House in Grosvenor Square and, soon after, for the country. 3rd. Arrival at Ashbourne Park. The first sight of Ashbourne Park was of wings that had been clipped. The Tudor east front sagged a little at the corner. The Palladian addition on the south wore its cracked columns like a faded actress wears her pearls. There were broad lawns that wanted rolling and parkland dotted with oaks that had not been properly thinned. The avenue was grand in the way of old mistakes, too long, too much, too proud. Meg loved it at once. "It will take all of it," said Daniel, standing with his hands behind his back like a general surveying a battlefield. "The income from your settlements, I mean." "Our settlements," Meg said before she could stop herself. Her voice sounded small in the cold stone hall. He glanced at her, then away over the heads of a great many servants who had lined up like pieces of old furniture, polished and underpaid. "This is Mrs. Broom," he said, indicating a housekeeper whose cap had been laundered so often it had lost its lace, "and Cooper, the steward. You will find them capable." "Capable of saving?" Meg asked, and saw a flicker in Cooper's face, as if someone had finally asked the correct question. "We shall see what is to be done," Daniel said, already striding away. The first weeks were hard in the way of all first weeks. The bedchambers were draughty, the attics full of songbirds that had found their way in and could not find their way out, the stoves too few and the hearths too wide. She learned quickly where the roof leaked, which doors would not stay closed, which servants had grown too old to carry trays, and which too proud to be told to try. She walked the estate in boots that sank to the ankle, Cooper at her side giving her the names of fields like lessons in an ancient language. "That is High Longclose, my lady. That's the Broderick Meadow. The home farms past the ha-ha, if you'll step careful. That copse wants coppicing. The South Orchard wants replanting entirely. The tenants at Mill Cottages had a bad harvest last year on account of the mold." "And this?" Meg asked, pausing before a half-roofed building that smelled faintly of stale ale and damp. "The old brewhouse," Cooper said. "Idle many years. His lordship prefers to purchase." "Does he?" Meg tucked the information away as one does a pin one knows will be useful. At meals, if Daniel dined at all, he dined late, after riding, after letters, after business with the agent, after shutting himself in the library with memories he had not invited her to disturb. He was polite. He was irreproachable. He was distant by practice and, she suspected, by fear. If he had a portrait of another woman framed on his desk, Meg chose not to notice it. If the servants murmured that the Marquis had been certain of the Beaufort match, she ignored them. If her heart sank sometimes alone in a room big enough to echo, she would light the candles and read. Or go down to the kitchens and watch Sally, her maid, flirt with the footmen, and learn the gossip she told no one. Meg had been given an old place in need of new thought. She did what Hartwell's did. She began to set it to rights. 4th, ledgers and lives. She asked for the accounts and kept them at her elbow with her tea. She asked where the rents were in arrears and went herself to see the men whose names were written in Cooper's careful hand. Day, who had a wife with a cough, Purvis, whose pig had been lost to fever, Stanley, who had 6 children and a suspiciously fat goose. "Your ladyship would not," Cooper began, when she suggested a reduction for the worst pressed. "Temporary," Meg said, "and only where it will preserve the tenant for the next year, not reward indulgence in this one. If we can let out the fishings on the West Stream, we will recoup a portion of it. And the South Orchard, how many trees will live to bear?" "Half," he said gloomily, "then plant twice over with hardier stock. I know a man in Berkshire who swears by a russet that could withstand a sermon. We'll sell the cider to the inn and the second best to the labourers at a price that will keep their coin in our pockets." Cooper looked at her then as one looks at an unexpected ally. "Begging your pardon, my lady," he said, "you talk sense." "I talk sums," she corrected, and he smiled. She reopened the dairy and set the old brewhouse to making small beer for the estate. She saw to it that the kitchen gardens were properly manured, that the smith's contract was rewritten at a fair rate, and that Mrs. Broom stopped ordering sugar as if they were feeding a regiment. She invited a builder to examine the sagging east wing and told him, with the calm of a general balancing casualties, which rooms would be shut up until better times and which must be made fit for company immediately. She donated coals to the cottage women whose husbands had lost work in the mills upriver, and engaged a schoolmistress to teach letters and arithmetic on Thursday afternoons in the old glove room. "Charity," Daniel said the first time he truly noticed her at dinner, intent on his mutton while she spoke to Cooper. It was the first remark he had made that brushed against judgment. "Investment," she said. "Healthy children will grow into healthier labourers. Readers will make better bookkeepers. If I can teach Mrs. Purvis to calculate a dozen at 3 prices, she'll not be cheated of her egg money, and the fewer men we have begging at this door, the more we may hire when the new hedge-laying begins." He looked at her with something that might have been amusement or annoyance. With him, the two were cousins in the same coat. "You are a phenomenon, Margaret." "I am a Hartwell," she said. "We reckon with what we are given." His eye fell then on the spreadsheet by her plate, and he smiled despite himself. "And we were given," he said, "this ungainly dining room with its ridiculous cherubs and a steward who resists my every change and a marchioness who talks of hedges at supper." "Do you object to hedges?" Her tone was light. "I object to having to marry to pay for them," he said, and then, as if he had not meant to let the thing out into the air, he lowered his gaze and applied himself to the mutton with unnecessary focus. The remark fell between them like a glass dropped on stone. It shattered. It cut. Meg laid down her knife. "No one forced you," she said. "Indeed," he said, "no one forces a drowning man to clutch at a rope." "He simply does." "Does the rope then deserve contempt?" she asked, very quietly. He looked at her then as if he had felt the point of something too slender to be called a blade. "No," he said after a moment, "only gratitude. But gratitude has a way of sticking in the throat." "Yes," she said, folding her napkin, "I have found it so." They did not speak of it again that night. But something in his countenance shifted, not toward her, not yet, but away from the fixed star of his resentment. She had tugged at its orbit. Verve, the house party. By April, Ashborne Park had begun to look less like a dowager in the wrong gown, and more like a woman finding her colour. The lawns were rolled, the kitchen garden put forth neat rows of peas and early lettuce. The tenants' wives now gathered of a Thursday in the glove room to copy out sums with chalk, and Mr. Day had stopped coughing, and one of the cottagers had named her new baby Margaret, without asking permission from anyone. "It will do," Daniel said one morning, looking out at the south terrace. "We will invite a small party for Whitsun." Meg smiled. It would be an advance, or at least an attempt at one. The local gentry had largely called. They were a practical lot, and their respect was easily purchased with polite dinners and repaired bridges. London, however, still observed the match with a degree of scandalised relish. "Only those who owe me a favour," he added, "and those whose presence we cannot avoid." "Very wise," she said, and told Mrs. Broom to air the beds in the west wing and fetch the best damask from the press. On the third afternoon of the house party, while Meg was reading aloud in the parlour, and the younger guests were out with the hounds, Lady Arabella arrived a day earlier than expected. The room stilled in that minute way rooms sometimes do, as if someone had inhaled and not yet exhaled. She was as beautiful as rumour insisted, fair, composed, wearing a gown of such perfection that it seemed immoral. Her smile was mild. Her eyes flicked to Daniel as surely as a compass in a field of iron. "My dear Lord Ashburn," she said, giving him her hand as if she were an empress and he a very cherished subject. "The roads were tolerable. Your park is improving." That little pause was a masterpiece of malice. "And your lady?" she added, turning to Meg with the air of a woman bestowing a kindness. "My lady is very well," Daniel said, taking a fractional step nearer to Meg's chair. "She is the reason anything here improves at all." It was nothing more than the truth. It was also the first time he had said it without condescension. Lady Arabella's eyes cooled a half-degree. "How industrious!" "Quite," Meg said calmly, and asked whether her ladyship would prefer tea or lemonade. Over the course of the next 2 days, Lady Arabella did very little and signified everything. She admired the park while implying it would never be what it had been, praised the mutton while observing the sauce was a trifle rustic, pitied the dairymaid who had so much to do and wondered whether anyone was minding the butter's temperature. She played Mozart in the evenings with skill and enviable wrists. At supper one night, as the company discussed the new canal, Arabella said, "I suppose it must be an advantage to have a wife who understands accounts. I have Daniel, who had been quiet, said, "I have come to find them more beautiful than I once did." Arabella laughed. "Then the world is truly upside down." "As you say," he returned, but there was a tone in his voice Meg had not heard before, a stubbornness that might yet be loyalty if it had something to fasten to. When the party ended and the guests had gone, he came into Meg's sitting room unannounced, looked around as if one might look into a church, and said, with abrupt sincerity, "You managed her very well." Meg glanced up from the letter to her father. "Lady Arabella? She required very little managing. A butterfly has little notion of the wind." He smiled, then sobered. "I was proud of you." It was a strange verb and perfectly chosen. Pride from a man like him did not feel like the prize of a race. It felt like a stone placed correctly into a wall. "Thank you," she said. He crossed to the fire, not meeting her eyes. "I should not have made the remark about the rope," he said. "I should not have made many remarks I have made." "It is difficult," she said, "to be rescued and to like it." "It is difficult," he agreed, "to be liked and not loved." She looked at the flames. "Then we are in the same boat, my lord." He stood there for a long minute, listening to the small sounds a room makes, wood settling, ashes sighing, a clock in the hall knocking its pendulum against the seconds. "Perhaps," he said at last, very low, "we might learn to row." 6. A slow season. The summer that followed was a stern tutor and a generous friend. There were weeks of rain when the low fields drank too deep and the tenants fretted, and weeks of sun when the barley turned the colour of lions' manes. There were mornings of work and afternoons of decisions and evenings of conversation that were less brittle than they had been. Daniel rode with her to visit the cottages, and she watched him ask questions and wait for the answers. She saw him once remove his coat and carry planks with the men repairing the footbridge, and she thought, unexpectedly, of the boy he must have been. Not yet armoured, not yet admired, not yet trapped. Sometimes, when the mood took him, he would tell her stories, of Eton, where he had been both adored and lonely, of Brussels, where the regent had said something scandalous to him at supper, of a summer at 19 when he and his brother had swum in the lake at midnight and emerged with gooseflesh and revelation. In return, she told him of counting-house games with her father when she was a girl, sums capped with peppermints, numbers that added up to fairness. She told him of the first time she had seen London from the river and thought it looked like a beast asleep, dangerous and glorious. If sometimes a look passed between them that promised more than conversation, it was a wary promise, and carefully kept. One afternoon in late August, Meg felt a queer sinking under her ribs that was not sorrow. In the morning she could not abide the smell of boiled eggs. By afternoon she wanted only oranges. By evening, even the sound of the pianoforte was too bright for her mind. Sally, who possessed more worldly wisdom than she advertised, examined her, pronounced herself very nearly certain, and then cried into the hem of her apron from sheer happiness. Meg told Daniel in the orchard, beneath the only pear that ever bore in abundance. She had expected him to be pleased in that aristocratic way that was partly a flourish and partly calculation. An heir solved, a line secured, a duty discharged. He was silent so long that the breeze finished its business with the leaves and wandered off. "Are you unwell?" he asked at last, very gravely. "I am," she said, and began to laugh, and then to cry in the same breath, which alarmed them both. He looked at her foolishly and, for the first time in their marriage, put his hands to her shoulders and drew her in, as if she were a thing of value. "I am glad," he said, and she could hear that he had not expected to be. "I am... Margaret, I did not know I could be so glad." She leaned her forehead against his coat and let her heart do something braver than it had done in years. 7. Rumours and roads. Pregnancy is a country with many roads, and Meg found herself travelling those she had not known existed. Weariness that laid her full length at noon, sudden cheerfulness at dusk, an appetite for oysters, and dislike of ham-house china, which made no sense at all. She and Sally consulted the midwife, who had hands like dry twigs and a voice like cream, and the physician, who smelled pleasantly of lavender and certainty. Daniel arranged for a nurse from the village with a good reputation for advice and small gossip, and then went one afternoon to London to put in an appearance at his club, see his man of business and stare down any person who raised an eyebrow. In town, he received a note in a fine, familiar hand. "My dear Lord Ashburn, I hear that your farms are prospering like a parson in a thunderstorm, and that your lady is the making of you. How clever you were to choose so sensibly. Pray, do come to tea. I promise to pour graciously and complain hardly at all. Arabella." He went from curiosity and habit, and because he had once thought his life would be a certain shape, and wanted to see what remained of it. She was as gracious as ever, as amused, as exquisitely dressed. She poured his tea, and asked whether he had heard the latest on D about Mrs. D and her pearls. She observed that the Regent's waistcoats were larger and his patients smaller. She inquired after his park in a tone that suggested parks were delightful so long as one did not have to step in them. She mentioned his lady with elegantly adjusted envy. "What a useful young woman! I confess myself entirely unsuited to damp fields. Not everyone needs suit everything," he said. She tilted her head. "I do not believe we would have suited at all, Daniel. In the end, we are best where we are put." On his way home, he found he was lighter than he had expected to be. He realised that the space in his mind where he had once kept Lady Arabella as a perfect idea had emptied itself without rusted hinges or noise. It had made room for something untidy, unplanned, and entirely his. He brought back oranges for Meg, who cried and laughed again and told him he was ridiculous, and kissed him on the cheek with a boldness that shocked them both into silence. 8. A night of prayers. The winter came down straight and hard, with ice at the edges of the lake, and a hoarfrost so precise that it drew lace on the windows with a needle. The roads were difficult. The midwife came daily, and declared herself content. Meg grew more beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with fashion. She had a certain look, a stillness, though she herself felt as ungainly as a barge and twice as slow. The child turned and moved, rolling under her hand like a fish beneath water. In the first week of January, with the stars cutting the sky into shards, the pains began. They were manageable, then alarming, then very much worse. Sally ran for the midwife for the doctor. the doctor for his case, the footman for hot water, Mrs. Broom for the laudanum that Meg refused. The house seemed to be a machine which had not been used in a very long time, suddenly thrown into labour, doors opening and closing, whispered orders, footsteps running along corridors that had never heard running. Daniel stood helpless at first, as men do who are large and can lift fallen beams and cannot do the one thing asked of them. "Go," said the midwife in that cream voice turned iron. "Pray, if you pray. Walk, if you walk. Don't faint in here. Your lady will not be distracted by your theatrics." He went. He did not know what else he could do. He walked out to the little chapel at the edge of the cedar walk, where the stones sweated cold, and the windows admitted what light the moon could spare. He had not bent his head to any altar with sincerity since he had been a boy, and had wanted a hound to live through the winter. He did it now with a directness that would have startled his club. "God," he said, quiet, because quiet seemed appropriate, "I am not much for bargains in this place. I have made too many in other rooms, but if you are taking requests tonight, take mine. Let her live. Let the child live if you are generous, but let her live if there is only one life to be spared. We've not been long married, and I have not deserved her, and I will not pretend otherwise. But I will do." He stopped. He had been about to say anything, and he knew enough of words to respect them. Even in prayer, he chose a promise he could keep. "I will change," he said hoarsely. "I will not despise what saves me." He stayed there on his knees until the stone and his joints were kin. He did not count the minutes. Time had lost its arithmetic. At last a sound came along the path, a step he knew. Sally burst in, hair awry, cap gone, eyes shining with tears that could be sorrow or joy. For a terrible half-second he saw only the tears, then she smiled like sunrise. "A daughter," she said, "a loud one. And her ladyship is tired, but she is with us." He could not think how to close his eyes long enough to feel the full wave of relief. He stood there and let it drown him with his eyes wide open. "Thank you," he said to Sally, to the chapel, to the cold, to the god of boys and hands and unlikely men. He put his hand on the back of a pew because it occurred to him that he might very well fall. When at last he was permitted to see Meg, the room was hot with the heat of enacted miracles. The midwife nodded at him once, as at a man who had presented acceptable credentials, and slipped out. Sally fussed with something at the hearth and gave them the grace of looking blind. Meg lay pale and very awake, her hair damp, her hand unadorned by anything but effort. The child slept in a basket at her side, small and perfect and offensively content, as if she had not nearly broken the world getting here. "Margaret," he said, and then realized that he could not say what he had come to say if he stood so far away. He went to his knees again because the posture felt right, and because he did not trust his legs near the bed. "I have been," he said, "a proud man, and a fearful one. I thought I had been robbed of what was promised me, and I resented what I was given. You have been a wife to me when I gave you little to be wife to. You have saved this place. You have saved me from myself, and now you have brought our child into the world, and nearly left me to bear that world without you." He reached up, not quite daring to touch her hand. "I am sorry. There is nothing elegant or sufficient to say but that. I am sorry for the look I have given you on mornings when there was frost on the grass and you were already at the dairy. I am sorry for calling you rope when I was drowning. I am sorry for not telling you." His voice broke. He had not expected it to do that, "for not telling you that I admire you so much it hurts. But I have come to, that I love you very much, in the plain way I had not known I could." She looked at him for a long time. He had never felt more clearly seen or more hopeful. At last she turned her head a fraction toward the basket. "Her name," she whispered. We must give her one. He laughed because life was ridiculous and sublime. You will choose, he said. You have done all the work. I have had help, she said, and her fingers with enormous generosity found his. Grace, she murmured, her eyes closing at last. Let her be Grace. Recovery. Recovery is a quieter country than Danger. It does not have trumpets. It has broth and sleep, and walks down corridors supported by a husband who pretends that he does not notice how much weight she leans on him. It has letters from fathers, written with ink blotched by grateful hands, and baskets of eggs from women who do not know how else to speak of their relief. It has a church full of faces on a Sunday morning, turned toward a family pew where a tiny bonnet bobs with every hiccup. It has a man who climbs out of himself and into usefulness. Daniel kept his promise. It did not happen with the drama of a thunderclap, but with the steadiness of a man learning a new trade. He rose early more often than he did not. He walked the fields with Cooper and listened. He met with the vicar about a fund for lying-in women whose rooms did not warm as quickly as his. He read accounts with Meg in the evenings and asked questions and did not pretend to be bored. Once, when Arabella's card appeared with the Hamiltons in the spring, Meg asked, "Would you like to have them down?" She said it without rancour. She found to her own astonishment that she bore none. He shook his head. "I find I am improved by a smaller acquaintance," he said dryly, and kissed the top of Grace's head with unfeigned devotion. They quarrelled sometimes, as married people do who are not saints. He wanted to have the lake dredged at once, and she wanted to wait for better prices. She wanted to build a new schoolroom, and he worried over the cost. They learned the trick of arguing without injury, and of laying down their weapons at the door of the nursery. They learned to want the same things, or at least to want one another most. Meg found that love, when it came for her, was not a fever but a climate. It warmed everything. It made the small days bright. She loved him not only for kneeling in a chapel in winter, but for taking the time to learn the names of the dairy cows and for listening with genuine absorption to Mrs. Day's description of her. She loved him for his laugh, which had grown more frequent, and for his contrition, which remained new enough to be beautiful. He loved her for many things too numerous to list, but secret among them was the memory of that first day in the orchard, the pear tree shaking out its leaves like coins, and her small, brave smile over their future. Harvest. A year after Grace's loud arrival, the harvest came in rich and clean. The tenants' wagons rolled up the drive. The housemaids put flowers on the stair. The dairy turned out butter that would have satisfied Mrs. Broom's grandmother. The first apples from the replanted south orchard filled the air with their temperate sweetness. Ashborne Park, no longer a dowager in a ragged gown, stood up straighter at last, its windows winking like satisfied eyes. They held a harvest supper on the lawn. The tables were set under lanterns strung like small new moons. The beer, Ashbourne's own, was exceptionally good. Mrs. Purvis counted the loaves with mathematical triumph. The vicar said a blessing he barely finished because Sally began the fiddling too soon. Children ran in packs and were caught. Old men stood at the edges and smiled their approval as if they had made the world. Meg, in a gown the colour of late wheat, stood with Grace on her hip and her hand tucked through Daniel's arm. She listened to the noise, which was the best noise she had ever heard. People who belonged making a music that included them. "Do you remember?" Daniel murmured near her ear. "The first evening we dined together in that wretched room with the wretched cherubs." "I do," she said. "I thought I would be cold forever." "Do you remember," he persisted, "what I said about drowning?" She smiled at Grace, who was fascinated by her own foot. "I remember everything." He turned her slightly toward him, as if there was a private wind only they felt. "I am not drowning now," he said. "I am swimming, Margaret, and the water is very good." "You are mixing your metaphors," she scolded fondly. "I am mixing my gratitude," he returned, and kissed her, to the loud delight of the village children, who appreciated a performance. Later, when the last lantern had burned low, and the steward had retired with the resigned air of a man who would be counting crockery until dawn, Daniel and Meg walked the terrace with Grace asleep against her father's shoulder. The moon lay on the lake like a promise kept. "Thank you," Meg said softly. "For what?" He shifted the baby gently, as if his whole body were a cradle. "For praying," she said, and put her hand against his heart, which felt, to her fingertips, exactly like a heart should feel. "For staying, for learning to row." He bent his head. "For needing to be saved," he answered, "so that I might have the honour of being saved by you." They stood a while in that exchanged understanding, in air that smelled of apples and small beer and the future. The house behind them glowed. The cedar walk was dark and safe. The chapel waited for the next bargain and the next gratitude, such as life makes of us all. When at last they went in, the door shutting very softly behind the three of them, Ashborne Park held its breath, and then exhaled with relief. It had the look old houses have when they are loved by people who have learned the price of things and the value of them, which are not the same and never will be. And in the nursery a small girl stirred in her sleep and resumed, at once, the work of being beloved and alive. If any passer-by in that part of the Shire wished in years to come to tell a story about a city's daughter and a nobleman who needed saving, they might tell it as a fable about money and manners, about ledgers and lands. But the tenants who were there would tell it this way: that two people, unequal in patience and pride, were given to one another as a remedy neither would have chosen, and a grace both learned a welcome. That there was a winter night when a proud man knelt and did not rise the same. That there was an orchard and a pear tree, and a baby whose first word was no, learned from a mother who had used it wisely when the world deserved it. And that the Marquis and his lady, who became in time simply Daniel and Meg to those who needed them, lived with their eyes open, with their ledgers balanced, and with their hearts, finally, at rest.